Hi, Robert.
Hi, Mushtaq. Have you had a good week?
Well, I had a great week actually. Thank you very much. And we're recording this at 8 p.m. my time, Friday. I'm looking forward to this session. So it's great that we are building the routine around it. So that's fine. And you know, since we're talking about a mapless world, I thought it would be nice to talk about maps in general and the way that maps were made and the uh, how cartographers made them. And one of the challenges that faced the map makers centuries ago is that the world is actually a sphere, while what they will need a flat map that they could put on a table. But when sailors go around the world, they need a way so that they could preserve the angles. So if a ship is moving in this direction, let's say, they needed a map so that they can maintain the direction of travel if they are going straight. But as we know, closer to the poles, the area is smaller, so you need to open it up. So what happens? You look at my hand like that. What happens? The areas that are closer to the poles, they become larger than they are. So, for example, Africa is probably 14 times larger than Canada. But if you look at the map, it doesn't look like that. And likewise, anything that's closer to the equator, they're actually closer to their real size. And this is called the Mercator projection, and it's not propaganda. It was a very very practical thing that they did back then. Of course, there are a few other things that the first uh, the first cartographers did. For example, the direction of north and south is something that we create. There is nothing in life that says um, Europe should be on top and Africa should be down. So that notion of who makes the map and how they infuse it with their views is something that I wanted us to talk about. What do you think?
It's a brilliant idea, and on two fronts. One, the simple observation about the geometry, so that when you take a spherical object and splice it open and lay it flat, you have to do something about the relationships and scales, and so that's an interesting observation in itself. And then the second is about the social nature of map making, and that the perspective taken by the person is nothing other than a perspective. So I'm sure if Australians were making the map, they would see themselves as on top. But of course, in the UK, we refer to Australia as down under.
Absolutely, yeah.
An interesting observation, but it is no more than an observation, because I'm sure they don't feel down and under.
They don't, yeah. I agree with you. And often the maps in the past were written with the center where they were made at the center of the world. And that's also quite natural things that we do as human beings. We see ourselves individually as the center of the social relationships around us. We see maybe our cities, our countries are at the center. And I think the awareness of that is an important thing, particularly in a world where the terrain is changing and the new maps to be written are up to us. We could make them in whatever way, shape, or form that we would like them to be.
Yeah, so let's just for a moment jump from history to contemporary. What you're making me think is that when you are using satellite navigation on your phone or in your car, there's often a little blue arrowhead that you can tap, and it centers the map on where you are. So if you want to understand where you are, you have the choice of saying, show me the whole picture, or zoom in to where I am now. And so we have a tendency, both with the technology and as individuals, to put ourselves at the center of our own story, and that
You're right.
always the most helpful. It's perfectly understandable, but it's not always the most helpful.
That's right. And actually, you're right. When I drive personally, there are two choices: is to keep the map sort of keep the true north so that you navigate through. But to me, I want, in a way, true north to be always to the front, because if I'm driving straight, but in actual fact the map's standing right, that will really confuse me. And again, these are sometimes these sort of lies that are very, very helpful because make the world easier to navigate, but they present a picture that's not exactly the world itself.
So let's just for a moment reflect on purposes in map making. So part of our earlier conversations have been this distinction between map reading and map making, and that's because we've been talking about leadership and the challenge of trying to navigate in territory that you've not been in before. There's a slightly different set of purposes, I think, historically in the production of maps, which were quite an expensive undertaking that required quite a lot of effort and expertise. And I guess part of the purpose was to proclaim the greatness of whoever had commissioned the map. So there was a tendency to put the sponsor of the map at the centre. So if this, in contemporary examples, if this map was being brought to you in association with some corporation, the corporation's headquarters might be the centre of the map. And in ancient times, it was often a nation state or a monarch or a commander who had placed themselves at the centre of the map. And that's a slightly different purpose than navigating into the unknown territory, because it is often, I think, to show the empire that I oversee. And in different time periods and in different civilizations or empires, the extent of the known universe was really just the edge of the empire that I own. So whether that was the Romans or the Ottomans, or they would draw the world as they saw it to the extent that where they had control over those territories. And then the bit that I think is analogous to our interest from earlier conversations about maplessness in the contemporary world is, what do you do about the bits you don't yet know? I think I've heard you in a previous conversation that in the bits that you don't yet know, we often attribute them some sense of jeopardy or scariness that would A, suggest that it's not important, and or B, suggest you maybe shouldn't go there.
Yeah, don't go there. Yeah, actually, there's at least one map now that we still have from that era, where the cartographer chose to write "Here be dragons," and I'm sure they did not really think that they're physical dragons, but it's that notion of, as you rightly said, there is some scariness or uncertainty, and maybe when you stay within what you know and you know well, you will be maybe better off. At least you will remain safe. So this is actually, I think we are sort of having three thoughts to talk about. So the last thought we talked about is the edge of the map, and it's the edge of the certainty that we have. And this can be applied to the dragons, this uncertainty that we have in our own personal life, in our careers, and our organizational strategy, and even at the geopolitical level. We also talked about the perspective and how the first accurate map of the world had Europe actually to the south and Africa to the north, because it was written by a Muslim scholar. His name was Al-Idrisi, and I think that was in 1154. And because for him, of course, where he came from should be on top. That's a sort of obvious thought. And then we talked about the projection and how sometimes we could project things in a bigger size. And the example I remember, sometimes when I look at people's LinkedIn profile, they would have maybe gone to a University A or University B, but sometimes I see people put Harvard or Oxford, and it sort of implies it's a degree, but when you check, it could be an online course or a one day program or something like that. And these things are all right. I think they are not necessarily good or bad, but being aware of all of them would be good, I feel.
And so there's a connection between that idea in contemporary life as to what brands and badges you stick on your LinkedIn profile, and the idea that in ancient times, the map was brought to you in association with the empire of somewhere or other, is the resource that went into that. And so that's a positioning statement, isn't it? And positioning is an important part of move making. I wonder if we could maybe turn our attention from talking about maps in this ancient sense to maps in the contemporary sense. You and I have both been over this week, I think, reading things about graduate prospects. And so last conversation, we had a discussion about the value or otherwise of education, and in particular, the value of a degree. But I've had 2 or 3 conversations this week that have been coincidentally about the transition from studying to working and how people find their way into that workspace. And of course, these days, the technology available to us through generative AI can help you apply for jobs by generating a CV or a cover letter. But at the other end of that, the same generative AI technology could be reading and sifting through hundreds of CVs. And it feels to me almost like there are no people involved in this whatsoever.
Right.
I read a newspaper article in the UK that was a young graduate who had graduated a year or two ago, was still searching for employment. And he told the story of going to this graduate fair and putting on a suit to make a positive impression and turning up at a hall, which was simply a group of stands that had QR codes on them and no people. And went and zoomed the QR scan into your camera, which took you to a link to upload your CV, and thinking how different that was from my experience of navigating from studying to working.
This is very, very interesting. But if we develop it further, because I feel for young people who are graduating now, they are competing against many people who are writing hundreds and hundreds of applications and automatically sending them to these AI to sift through them. So, what would be the advice that we give them, and if we would try to again to anchor it in this mapless world, and what kind of map that we create and what are the edges of it. So if someone chooses to go and meticulous way write the application, read the job description, even writing one job application well could require a couple of hours, could take the whole day, and it's quality versus quantity. And if you are sure that there is someone at the other end, at least maybe they will value this human connection or even the imperfection in your language or your CV, because it indicates efforts and authenticity. Or they should actually just join this game and try to create as many applications as possible and hope for one of them to hook. So what do you think our advice should be?
So I'm not going to answer the advice question just yet. I'm going to just think about what we've been speaking about today in relation to mapped and mapless and perspectives.
Yep.
Thinking about the difference between you and I reflecting on what would we advise somebody to do versus somebody who's in those circumstances. So you and I might be inclined to say, well, you should write your CV and your cover letter yourself. You should find opportunities to have face-to-face contact with someone to make it human. Maybe you do some volunteering or internship work that gives you an opportunity to build relationships, to build credibility. There's always this challenge, I think, in the job search of getting the experience that you require to do the job, but how do you get the job if you haven't got the experience? An existential challenge at every level in careers, isn't it? That if you've never done the thing before, you need to demonstrate that you could do it. And so volunteering is one good way into that for early career folks. A different framing from somebody who's one of our younger students graduating today might be that what we see as mapless, they see as mapped. And so it's a question of using the best technology available to compete in a system within the framing that the map is the technology. So that can run to earlier conversations of what layer of the map are you looking at. So you and I might give advice which is to fight against the idea that generative AI is at play, and somebody else's perspective might be to fight within a framing that that technology exists and that you have to just exploit it to the best of your ability.
But I think probably, as in most of the cases, the truth or the right path is somewhere in between. So you still produce that quantity, but I think that social notion is so important. I think there was once a paper about the strength of weak links. I think even the title could be that. It's one of the most cited papers, I think, in social sciences, and it talked. It went to, yes, the strength of weak ties. Yes, and I think so clearly you knew about it or read it. And the idea is a huge number of people were asked, how did you get your job? And so many of them, they said, I get it through a friend of a friend. And I think that notion of having someone who will maybe recommend you or point you out to a job that is available will remain an important thing. So while things are being disrupted, the landscape is being disrupted by technology, and you can't just ignore it and then produce one application a day while someone else is producing hundreds and hundreds. I think the quantity game is there to be played, unfortunately, whether you like it or not. But I think to also focus on that element, which is to volunteer, to connect, because ultimately these are the things that will make difference in the long term. And I think we should probably be able to do both to a certain level.
Yeah. So if we take that idea of the strength of weak ties and connect it to our earlier conversation about the boundaries and there be dragons, the weak ties, the friend of a friend, is often in a part of the map that you know less well. So maybe
Yes.
one of the strategies of how you expand the territory that you cover would to work through a network of networks. And then a second line of thought is this idea of taking content production, which I think is quite different than when you and I were entering the job market. But whilst you might be denied the opportunity to have face-to-face interviews, our digital footprint is simply a different representation of us. You should take the podcasting experience that you and I are having. If we were applying for a job in broadcasting, some of the best thing to do would be to say, well, this is the best content I can produce. You don't need anybody else's permission to do that. You do need to try and find their attention somehow. But it does seem to me that our current generation of graduating students are much more familiar with the idea that they have to curate their own content and demonstrate their own capacity, capabilities, skills, preferences through the content that they produce.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful and very relevant way to look at it, and it actually get me to think of one time I received a job application by mail, and the applicant actually put a book inside the job application. He said that, I know you are interested in X, Y, or Z, and I thought this book might be something that you would like to read. And you know what? I read this job application that opening that the university has, and I would love to have a chat with you. And that effort made the application stand out. Of course, what makes it stand out is there's a skin in the game in a way, because I would know that this person won't be able to send 500 books to 500 people, because that means they'll have to spend quite a bit of money on that. But the idea is, it gave me the impression that first he approached this very differently. He really was very interested in the job, and I think these are some of the more creative ways maybe that will emerge because we human beings, and hopefully our students, we believe in them. We believe we have taught them well, and we worked with them, and we have been part of their journeys, and they worked with very clever people. And the war of attention, because at the end of the day, a human being will make the decision, and that human being will have 1 hour to look at the last 50 applications that AI have filtered. And then we need to stand out, or maybe even better, if you are able to shortcut this whole process and make it to the 50 last applications, rather than going through the AI. So it's an evolving space, but an important one nonetheless.
So I'm thinking about the relationship between historic practice that you and I have experience of and contemporary digitally enabled practice. And although they seem on one level to be very different, in actual fact, the same thing is happening in both cases, which is something very difficult to describe, but recognizable when it's there. So as you say, you and I have had many experiences of having a pile of application letters and CVs that you have to shortlist. And with the best will in the world, you read them all, but when you've read the 17th and 18th and 19th, it's hard to keep the same freshness. But there are some that just stand out, and the speed at which we make those initial impressions as to what stands out or doesn't is remarkably fast, actually. And so I suspect that all that's happening in the digital equivalent of that is that there are that those filtering exercises are still going on, but the triggers for the filters might be slightly different. But you've given an example of somebody whose application stood out because they were creative.
Yes.
That I can think of other applications that I've read where the quality of the argument or the prose or the examples used or the formatting or there's something about it that makes it feel very distinctive, personal, engaged. And if you think of the ones that you tend to flick over and be less impressed by, they're more generic. And so, I've had experiences recently of people applying for jobs where they haven't even bothered to correct the job title that they're applying for. And so make it clear that this is just a letter that they send to everybody in the hope that, somebody will like it.
Yeah, I think those people who don't pay attention to that level, they'll be filtered out very quickly, and that is unforgivable. But my challenge with the quality of the argument is that people now often assume that this was written by AI because AI is getting very good at this. And if I were to just tell you a quick story that happened just today, I was invited to a conference that has more than 2,000 people actually attending. And the panel session that I was on was about enabling the youth through leadership and education. Each one of us was given 10 minutes to sort of make their argument. And the other three speakers chose to write something and read it. It was very eloquent, of course. And I usually don't like to read from a piece of paper. So I went and I just spoke from my heart. As a matter of fact, I chose to speak about the mapless world and how the new maps need to be different and so on. And after the session, many people came to me and they said, "Oh, I was a better speaker. My argument was better, although it was full of and ah, because I was speaking and thinking at the same time." And one of them told me, the other speakers, clearly they wrote this by AI and they just read it at us. So I think now people assuming that, things, even if even if they were written by humans, they are good, then that lingering thought that this might be done with AI, which actually is pushing the human creativity, I feel. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's pushing the human creativity so that what would you do to stand out? How would you reach out? How you build the human connection? And potentially these are the things that maybe if you just talk about them for a while, these are the skills that we need to teach and need to teach more and need to teach more intentionally to our students and to the young people who are willing to listen to us.
So this week's conversation has been us reflecting on things which have happened to us since we last spoke. So I was at a seminar and there was a guest speaker from an Australian university. I think his name was Danny Liu. I'll find it and check. And he was talking about the way in which the relationship between high school education, university education, and the workplace. And he had a little sort of graphic Venn diagram type thing where he was saying universities have historically always focused on stuff, the knowledge about something or other, whether that's medicine or law or engineering, or to the theory and models and frameworks that you need to be qualified in that space. And we're very good at teaching that and very good at assessing it. Then there's a second thing which is around skills, some of which are transferable skills, and they are not necessarily the same thing as the stuff. And then there's a third thing which he labelled soul, which is the kind of attitudes, outlooks, beliefs of the person. And what he was arguing was if you speak to employers about what are the most important things you're looking for in graduates, you get lists of things which sit in the skill space and in the soul space and not so much in the stuff space. But when you look at what we actually teach, it's mostly in the stuff space. And so that connects to an earlier conversation that we've had about the importance of the Empower program and the work that you do on impact statements at Heriot Watt in the Malaysia campus, but because they are trying to make systematic this awareness of who you are and what you value and then how you interact with colleagues in the workplace.
I think, Robert, in a future episode, we may actually talk a little bit more about impact statements and the experience that both of us had, because again, you were one of the people who truly supported that. And I still remember one time when we had the session for the executive, and I know one of our colleagues was clearly trying to do the least possible, just to show that he may not be as open or warm to that idea. But anyway, we can tell the story later, because I think there is a value in that. And I also wanted to try to probably link this to the three ideas that we talked about: the dragons, the projection, and the perspective. And what advice would be given to someone? I know I always use the word advice. I assume this fatherly figure, and you will correct me always, and who wants to hear our advice. But anyway, what suggestion we would be giving to not only the young people who are graduating, but even people who are navigating jobs, been hearing about many multinational companies laying off people by the thousands. And these are highly skilled, highly creative. Some of them are still in their prime, and I'm sure they are looking for something else. So I would maybe start by one suggestion around the dragons is actually laying out the edge of what we think is possible, or what we think we can and we should do, is very helpful. I was talking to a colleague of ours. He's at the Dubai campus, and I saw a job opening, and I actually texted him and I said, "Are you applying for this?" He said, "Mushtaq, I'm not ready. There's no way I'll be even considered." So I said, "Well, you could apply for that, and then even if you are not selected through the feedback, you could benefit." He said, "Well, thank you very much for believing in me, but I think I'm not ready. I will not do it." So I felt like I really needed to push. So I said, "Let me ask you a question. If a student of yours came to you and said, 'There is a job, but I'm not ready for it yet,' would you advise them to apply and try and go through the process? Or would you advise them actually to wait for 5 years and see if they are ready or not?" And he flipped in a second, really say, "I got you. I think I'm going to really engage with this job. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to write a cover letter. Would you mind actually reading my cover letter?" I say, "I would love to do that." And I know it was a stretch, but I think there's a dragon without we, pushing. First, identifying the dragon, which is maybe I'm not ready, I don't have the skill, the people don't like me. That requires a change of place of stay. And I know you, from your experience, I think you've done, you pushed that, you pushed your map, and I think you slayed some dragons in that sense. So that's probably my one suggestion that I will be having.
So here's my counter suggestion, or not suggestion, it's an observation. I'm going to suggest a new metaphor. I like metaphors. You're familiar with Schrodinger's cat?
Yeah. Was what? Sorry. Yes, Schrodinger's the cat. Yes, the cat. Yeah.
The idea of the cat is in a box and is both dead and alive until we look.
That's right.
I think at the boundary of mapped territory, where it says there might be dragons, it should also say in brackets, there might not.
Right.
So
yes,
dragon would be, well, what's the worst that could happen? You apply for a job that you're nowhere near ready for in your own mind, and you discover that people see in you things they don't see, or that you don't see in yourself. Or you discover that despite the fact you're not actually ready, they're so desperate because nobody else has applied that you get an opportunity. Or a conversation I had this morning with someone who was saying at an interview stage in a key part in her career, someone said, "I could see you only had 50% of the skills, but I could see you had the attitude, and I felt I could train the rest of you."
Right.
And so we don't know whether there are or aren't dragons until we look. And so I think that does call forth from us as individuals a sense of agency to take command of our own destiny and decide how brave we want to be.
And an interesting thing, when we are asked to reflect on matters, or give advice or suggestion, because the world is changing so much and the territory is changing, I feel that we are falling back on the basics, which is believe in yourself, push the limit. Maybe there's no dragon, and maybe the dragon is dead, and you could just, someone else have slayed it, and you could actually just move on, have a sense of purpose. So actually, I think in a way, I don't see this as a negative thing. I see it as that in that sea of change, going back to basics, doubling down on humanity, holding the human connections, the friendships that we've built so close to our heart because they are so precious, is, the advice that we are giving. And this is the advice that anyone would have given 1,000 years ago, and they would have remained valid. So they are quite timeless in that sense. So these are probably the timeless maps. There are some timeless maps.
And so I agree wholeheartedly with value what you want to value and take the risks that you feel able to take. I think as the economy is changing for our young graduating students starting their career, they could continue to spread bet and try engaging with existing businesses in a very competitive process to be recruited, whilst at least spending some of their time and attention thinking, what do I have agency over and what could I do? And that might be to create content of your own, to create business opportunity of your own, to create experience of your own, because at least then you're doing something.
I think as we come to the close of this session, I think this is a message of hope. And I think we survived the mapless world, then we mapped it fully, and now the terrain is changing, but it's the same skills and the same capabilities at heart that we will be needing so that we build these new maps, because we are at heart adventurous map makers and cartographers, and who knows, we could be not only us specifically, but the people we are talking to will be actually writing and making some new maps that will be so amazing that will take us to new horizons and new dimensions.
Yeah. And so a thing that we definitely share is that we're both optimists.
Yes, and I think that's a requirement if you are in education, particularly in the teaching part of it, teaching side of it. Because if we are not optimistic, how can we deal with that endless human potential, particularly when things and what's happening in the world may not be very positive? I think that's a very good thing to be an optimist now.
Good. Great conversation. I look forward to
As usual. Thank you very much, and I will be seeing you next week.
next week. Have a great weekend, Mushtaq.
Have a great weekend yourself.